All right, you guys. So, welcome into topic 5.3. Today, we are going to talk about the Mexican American War. So, we are still here in period number 5, 1844 to 1877. But today, we're going to focus specifically on the Mexican American War. So, here, keep in mind that your AP learning objective by the time we finish this section, this topic, you should be able to considerably explain the causes and effects of the Mexican American War. But again, just because today we're focusing on causation, cause and effect, don't forget that you can always think about contextualization. How did we get here? What led up to the Mexican American War? So you have things like Stephen F. Austin, who started bringing in American settlers into what was then Spain. Then Mexico wins its independence. So this is now Mexican territory. But Stephen F. Austin is bringing in these now Texans, these American settlers, these white American settlers, who then bring in slaves with them as well, until we have a population of around 9,000 people, including 2,000 slaves. So think about that context. Then you think about the Texas battle for independence that we touched on in 5.2, and then think of again the Battle of the Alamo, the battle at San Jacinto, where Santa Anna officially surrenders to the Texans, and then you have the creation of the Republic of Texas, and then pretty immediately the Republic of Texas wants to be annexed and added as a state to the Union in the United States, and that takes time. And so when we get there, we'll talk about some of that at the beginning here when we talk about James K. Polk. Um, that sort of starts to set the stage for the Mexican American War. So again, just because we're focusing on causation of this one particular event, the cause and effect, don't forget that you can always include context when you talk about these things. So let's get started. Let's dive right into it. We'll start talking here with the election of 1844. Now, by the time of the election of 1844, Texas had been an independent country for just short of a decade, right? Texas gets its independence in 1836. So you're looking at right around 8 to 9 years of Texas independence, right? The Republic of Texas. And you have many Southern Democrats who are increasingly supportive of annexation. And again, remember some of the context here. When Texas was a republic, there were two presidents, Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, who decided not to annex Texas, not to add Texas into the United States. And you want to think of, again, the further context of that. There had just been this huge political conflict with Missouri, adding Missouri in as a slave state, then having to carve out Maine as a free state, right? That caused a lot of political turmoil in the United States. So those two presidents, Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, decided not to do that because they did not want to have that political debate, right? They didn't want to engage in that. And they also didn't want to expand slave territory. So, because there was not yet a free state to add to the United States to kind of keep the balance. But Southern Democrats and Democrats in general are increasingly supportive of the idea of annexing Texas. Sounds about right because Texas had slavery, so they wanted to expand that slavery. So Southern Democrats decide to kind of not nominate Martin Van Buren for reelection in 1844. Instead, they decided to nominate James K. Polk. Now, Polk, he's super supportive of expansion. He shares the enthusiasm of adding Texas. He thinks it's a great idea. So, of course, Southern Democrats find their man in James K. Polk. So, here in the election of 1844, the two candidates are Henry Clay and James K. Polk. Henry Clay for the Whigs, Polk for the Democrats. Now, when we look at the election results, James K. Polk will win the presidency with an electoral vote of 170 to 105. It's not the biggest of margins. It's, what is that, 60-ish, 55, 60 votes. But when you look at the popular vote, the actual number of votes that are cast, the margin of victory is actually really small. It's 38,000. And if you think of, say, the city of McAllen, which is nearby, right? The city of McAllen has 120,000 people. So it's not a huge victory it's really not a huge victory for James K. Polk. It's a pretty big victory electoral college wise. But again, this is why it's important to remember that we do not elect presidents based on popular vote. We elect presidents based on a electoral college system. So each state, and you see the states highlighted here in the different colors, each state has a presidential election. So, for example, you see the state of Louisiana has 6 electors. So, you total up the number of votes, and whoever wins in Louisiana, they could win by 10 votes in some cases, right? They could win by a very small margin. And I'm not saying that that was the result here, but even if, let's say, James K. Polk had won Louisiana by 1,000 votes, he gets those 6 electoral votes. So that's the process that we have for nominating presidents, or excuse me, for electing presidents. So even though the real margin, 38,000 votes, is really, really small, and then the electoral college vote win of 55 votes isn't like small, but it's not huge. It's not the greatest margin. James K. Polk considers this to be a mandate for expansion, full on in the spirit of manifest destiny. And remember, just to include some context with that, the phrase of manifest destiny, right? The idea had kind of been there for the United States to keep expanding. The idea of expanding west has been in America since colonialism, right? When the British started having colonies here, the American colonists kept wanting to push further and further west. Britain fought wars over the fact that the colonists kept expanding westward. So the idea of moving westward was around. But manifest destiny as an idea, the term really was coined right around 1840. We talked in 5.2 about a journalist who wrote an article and kind of first used that phrase. Okay. So the election happens in November of 1844. Polk takes office right around March, I believe, of 1845. And by December of 1845, Texas becomes the 28th state in the country. And right away, this sets up the United States to have a dispute with Mexico, because Texas had already been having a dispute with Mexico that would have probably set them up for some conflict, right, and war with Mexico. But now that we are part of the United States, Texas is part of the United States, we get into the causes for war. And the main cause, is a boundary dispute over the border of Texas. Now, the Texans, and then supported by James K. Polk later, claimed that the Rio Grande River was the western and southern border. So you see that highlighted here in red. The Rio Grande River kind of comes out of what is today Colorado, makes its way south, and along the southern border, again, of what is today the border of Texas. Now, Mexico claims that the border is actually further north, that it is the Nueces River. Now, the Nueces River, if to kind of give you some context of where that is, it meets the Gulf of Mexico just outside of Corpus Christi. So it is pretty further north, a few hours north of here. But again, that sets up where this territory highlighted in orange is disputed territory between the Texans and Mexico. And then now, as the United States has annexed and taken over Texas and added Texas into the Union, it's now the United States' problem. And it makes sense. We want to think again back to the context of Stephen F. Austin bringing in settlers here. The place where most of those American settlers and then Texans lived is that area highlighted in yellow. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't some that lived in this area, this territory highlighted in orange, but most of them lived in the yellow region. So it makes sense. You can understand why Mexico says that's the border, right? Because that's where you guys live. You won your independence. That's where you are, right? But again, the Texans wanted more, as was the case. So James K. Polk decides to side with the Texans, and he decides to send a small army under the command of Zachary Taylor to Texas to protect the new state from an invasion from Mexico. I don't know if Mexico really would have invaded, but that's what James K. Polk does, and unfortunately, this sort of sparks the war with Mexico eventually. So, in April of 1846, Taylor's troops cross into Mexican territory. So, Taylor's forces actually came to the Rio Grande River, came to Brownsville, and at one point went into what is today Matamoros, right? So even if we debate whether the border is the Rio Grande River or the Nueces, they went to Brownsville. That was disputed territory. Okay, you're staking your claim. But even if you claim that the Rio Grande River, is the border, you went south of that border. So really, in the grand scheme of things, the United States invaded Mexico. Okay, And when they did, when they crossed the Rio Grande River, Zachary Taylor's forces were attacked by Mexican troops. Now, this news went around. James K. Polk learns of this attack. Mind you, again, Zachary Taylor's forces were in Mexico, even by the standards set by the Texans when they considered the border to be the Rio Grande River. Zachary Taylor was south of the Rio Grande River. He was in even what he would consider Mexico. So James K. Polk goes to Congress. Remember, this is the system that we have. The president just doesn't decide to declare war. He has to go to Congress. Congress has to approve it. And James K. Polk goes to Congress, asks them to declare war. And this happens in May of 1846. So Texas had only been a state for 5 months. And Congress declared war on Mexico by votes of 40-2 in the Senate and 174-14 in the House. So pretty overwhelmingly, the United States declares war on Mexico. And again, understandably, American troops were attacked by another country, but the story was not told the best, right? The idea of the story was that Zachary Taylor's forces were attacked along the Rio Grande River, but in reality, they had gone across the river into what even they would have considered Mexico. And again, that's a kind of story for a different day. But in a speech to Congress, James Polk had said, "The cup of forbearance has been exhausted, even before Mexico passed the boundary of the United States, invaded our territory, and shed American blood on American soil." So here, James K. Polk is telling Congress what had happened, and this is accurate. Zachary Taylor had crossed the Rio Grande River into what is Matamoros. The Mexican soldiers in that region attacked him. So then Zachary Taylor then retreats back to what is now Brownsville, and the Mexican army followed them. And that's where the battle happened. They're at Fort Brown. Okay. So, yes, we did see American soldiers shot and blood spilled on American soil. American soil. It was disputed territory. But that was the speech that came, and that's what convinced Congress to declare war. So the United States was officially at war with Mexico. But again, it is important to note it was in fact Mexican territory, right? It was in fact Mexican territory where Zachary Taylor's forces were originally attacked. But again, the United States now officially at war with Mexico. So really, what are the causes? We had a boundary dispute. We sent forces, and here I'm talking in terms of we, the United States. We had a boundary dispute of where the border was. We sent soldiers to Brownsville to protect what we considered to be the border. We went south of that, were attacked, came back. There was an attack then in Brownsville around Fort Brown. And that is what convinced James K. Polk and then convinced Congress to declare war on Mexico. Okay. So again, this is May of 1846. So now let's take a look at the war itself. So as the war kind of goes on, the war starts in May of 1846. You have a lot of people who start to be very opposed to this war, right? Domestic opposition. When we talk about domestic, we're talking about here in the United States, domestic. Foreign would be in the rest of the world, international. But opposition grows in the United States. You have a lot of Northerners who kind of fear that this war would lead to the expansion of slavery, further expansion of slavery, especially if we added more territory. But others feel that James K. Polk kind of misled Congress about the original outbreak of war. And that's kind of going back to that story I was telling you about how Taylor and his forces actually went into Matamoros and then kind of brought the Mexicans back into Brownsville. The United States was the aggressor in the war. They were the aggressive party. They were the ones who sort of caused this war and kind of technically invaded Mexican territory. So the farther north you go, because remember, Southern Democrats, very supportive of annexing Texas. Southern Democrats, very supportive of James K. Polk. But so the further north you go from Texas, as you go further and further north, this war, which became known as Mr. Polk's War, becomes so much more unpopular. Okay. Now, the fighting, pretty quick, right? Again, the war starts in um, May of 1846. So by the time we get to February of 1847, the United States had kind of claimed and won control of nearly all of the northern part of Mexico, north of Mexico City. So here you can kind of see on the map where these battles took place. The black lines are um, U.S. troops. So we see some invasion into the Rocky Mountain territory. You see some disputes and battles taking place here in what is now New Mexico. Okay, in Los Angeles, in California. Again, this was also important for California. Remember, California's next. We see people start going there in 1849, but the United States had taken most of the control of the territory north of the capital city. Okay, and you also see that we used warships, Navy ships as well, to kind of invade some of these territories. So most of this territory north of the capital city um, was claimed by the United States. And then when we get to September of 1847, so just over a year after the war had began, Americans actually fought their way into the capital, into Mexico City, and claimed the presidential palace and won control of that. And that really pushed the Mexicans to the negotiating table, because if they didn't negotiate with the United States would have most likely taken over the country. We would have taken over Mexico. So again, this is September of 1847. So when we get to February of 1848, after a few months of negotiations and things like that, you come up with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So the terms that are accepted here is that Mexico accepts that the boundary of Texas is the Rio Grande. So we accept that now Texas is the area highlighted in yellow. Mexico also cedes New Mexico and Upper California for $15 million. That is this territory here in red. And that's all in February of 1848. Okay. Now you see there's a little section of what is now New Mexico and Arizona, this little southern tip. It's not until 1853 that we make an agreement with Mexico to purchase that small strip of territory for $10 million. So we call the area in red the Mexican cession, and then the area in green is the Gadsden Purchase. And then that is the expansion of American territory now all of the way to the west. And so this is where, again, 1848, the United States takes claim of New Mexico and California. And then later, we start discovering gold. So that's where we get the gold rush, the 49ers. So again, this is also helpful for you to include some context into the gold rush. How did we get to be able to have people move to California, right? The Mexican American War was how we did that. So now let's take a look as we kind of start to wrap up here on the impacts of the Mexican American War. So one of the first impacts is nationalism. Again, nationalism is this sense of pride, this sense of kind of extreme patriotism, if you will. So these feelings of nationalism are strengthened. The idea of manifest destiny, right? Look at how much territory we were able to successfully claim after the Mexican American War. So this idea of manifest destiny becomes so much stronger, and I think that leads into people immigrating to California, people moving to California during the gold rush, then people moving into Utah, right? Other places that we've talked about. So the second is the debate over slavery. So this is 1848. We are just about 12 years till the Civil War. So the debates over slavery in these territories now becomes much more intense, because now we have these territories. We have to figure out what we're going to do. We have these ideas that we're going to move further and further west. What happens to these territories? Is slavery allowed? And this is why Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson did not want to annex Texas, because they knew the debate over slavery would be so much more intense if they did, and they were right. And then, of course, as with anything, as we push further west, there's conflict with the Native Americans. This obviously continues, and it becomes much more intense as white Americans move further and further west. And we've talked about some of that. We talked about that in 5.2, and we talked about California. All right. So, what are the key takeaways from the Mexican American War? So, first, the United States adds large territories in the West through victory in the Mexican American War with diplomatic negotiations, raising questions about the status of slavery, American Indians, and Mexicans in the newly acquired lands. So, again, you have the yellow or orangey Texas. And we'll talk about later why the shape of Texas changes eventually. You have the red portion of what is now modern day New Mexico, Utah, and California. And then, of course, the green section, which is the Gadsden Purchase. And then number two, U.S. government interaction and conflict with Mexican Americans and American Indians increased in regions that were newly taken from American Indians and Mexico, altering those groups' economic self-sufficiency and cultures. So item number two here, your second takeaway, is something we'll talk about more and more as we go. But that will wrap up topic 5.3. I'll see you for the next one tomorrow.